In the spring of 1943, at Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, German engineers unfolded photographs and shipping manifests, like a crime scene map. They weren't reading propaganda, they were reading metallurgy, gear ratios, and the fine print of an enemy factory system. And what they found did not fit their assumptions. The Germans watched with interest. They weren't tracking a new gun. They weren't tracking a thicker plate. They were tracking a machine that simply stayed alive. That was the part they feared. It started with one tank, a captured American M4 Sherman taken intact in Tunisia and delivered into the hands of the Heereswaffenamt test establishment. And by the time it rolled onto the proving ground, it wasn't the armor that bothered them. It was the hours. On the 22nd of February 1943, near Spitla in Tunisia, Panzerabteilung 501 took an intact M4A1 Sherman from the U.S. 1st Armored Division. The Germans drove it roughly 350 kilometers to Tunis over 4.5 days, then shipped it north for evaluation. They even kept the American nickname still painted on the hull, War Daddy 2. The Germans watched with interest. Captured tanks were routine, French, British, Soviet, but this one was different because it arrived complete, not burned, not stripped, not cannibalized into a bunker turret. A running modern American medium tank, exactly the kind of Butapanzer their laboratories existed to dissect. They set it beside their own machines. Panther prototypes, Panzer IVs, recovery half-tracks, test rigs, and they began the work the way German ordnance officers always did. Measure, diagram, stress, break. They couldn't quite believe it. The Sherman's layout looked industrial, not elegant, not obsessive, practical. Inside the hull were choices that screamed one priority, a tank built for replacement, not a duelist, not a masterpiece, a system. So what were they really looking for? They expected to confirm American inferiority, a crude transmission, sloppy casting, bad tolerances, something their own design culture could dismiss. Instead, they kept circling the same evidence, the automotive group, the final drives, the accessibility of components. And then the tests started to whisper a larger truth. The Germans watched with interest, because the Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a production doctrine on tracks. Its combat weight sat in the low 30-ton class. Its crew was 5. It carried the kind of engine and drivetrain that could be swapped, serviced, and returned to the line without a factory artisan standing over it. And the Germans knew what that meant, because by 1943 their own tank park was already becoming a maintenance battlefield. They had designed for superiority in the duel. But war was becoming something else. By early 1943, German panzer units in Tunisia were already improvising. They were patching engines with scavenged parts. They were forming provisional companies with captured British tanks. They were cannibalizing to keep a fraction operational. In the desert, any tank was better than no tank. So both 15. Panzer Division and 21. Panzer Division had already formed captured tank units back in 1941. By February 1942, the Afrika Korps consolidated captured British armor into a single unit that fluctuated up to about 18 tanks, depending on breakdowns and new captures. That detail matters, because it wasn't theory anymore. The German army was already living off scraps. Now, the Sherman rolled into the test lanes, and for once the Germans were not testing an idea. They were testing the future. What happened next stunned them, because the Sherman did not present itself like a fragile prototype. It started, it ran, it tolerated abuse, and every hour it ran was an accusation. The Germans watched with interest, not because it was invincible, but because it was consistent. Consistency was the real killer in industrial war. Consistency meant the enemy could plan. Consistency meant a tank battalion didn't collapse into a repair yard after a single hard week. And that's where the realization began. Something else had happened. Someone new was in command, not in Berlin, not in OKW, in Detroit. In 1942-1945, the Americans built the Sherman in numbers Germany could not mirror with Panthers or Tigers. Total Sherman production is commonly cited at 49,324 units across variants. The Germans knew their own numbers. They could count Tigers like trophies. They could count Panthers like scarce medicine. But the Sherman implied a different arithmetic. Not how many can we perfect? How many can we keep coming? First, it changed what loss meant. A German commander could knock out tanks and still lose the campaign if the enemy replaced them faster than he replaced crews. And the Western Allies had built the war to do exactly that. The Germans watched with interest, because the Sherman's real weapon was not its gun, it was the recovery chain behind it. In Normandy, U.S. tank losses were real. So were repairs. So were replacements. But the tempo kept rising anyway. On Omaha Beach on the 6th of June 1944, the 741st Tank Battalion's duplex drive plan collapsed under season timing. Of 29 DD tanks launched, 27 sank before reaching the beach. By that evening, the 741st had lost 48 tanks, with 45 killed and 60 wounded. The Germans watched with interest. That should have been a wound that crippled an armored force. It wasn't, because the American system treated it as an input, not a catastrophe. A battalion bled steel and kept moving. They couldn't quite believe it. And then Normandy turned into the second proof. The Sherman, in the hedgerows, had problems. So the Americans welded solutions onto the nose. A field invention, the Cullen hedgerow cutter, turned bocage into passable terrain. Not by redesigning the tank, by modifying it at scale, fast, and then shipping the idea across units. The change was too rapid, not because the Germans were blind, but because German change required committees, scarce steel, and Hitler's interference. American change required torches and production lines. So what went wrong for Germany? The answer arrived in late July 1944. The front didn't break because the Sherman suddenly became a tiger. The front broke because the Allies solved movement. They tore a hole near St. Lo and then made it wider with speed. On the 1st of August 1944, George S. Patton took command of Third Army in France, and the German view of the war began to shift from defend the coast to survive the pursuit. The Germans watched with interest. They weren't tracking a division. They weren't tracking a single bridgehead. They were tracking a tempo, and Patton was the clearest expression of it. General Gunther Blumentritt later described Patton as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, closest to the German ideal of speed and initiative. Enemy perception line, logged. They regarded Patton extremely highly. They saw him as the Allied commander who moved like them, and that was terrifying. But this story isn't only about Patton. It's about why the Sherman made Patton possible. Because high-speed exploitation requires something banal: fuel, parts, road discipline, vehicles that don't die from their own transmissions. The Germans watched with interest. Because the Americans didn't just push tanks forward, they pushed an industrial highway behind them. By late August 1944, Allied armies were consuming gasoline at a rate the pre-invasion plans hadn't truly anticipated. One U.S. quartermaster history notes average consumption well over 800,000 gallons per day during the critical week 20 to 26th of August 1944. It cites First Army using 782,000 gallons of motor fuel on the 24th of August alone. That number is not romantic. It is not heroic. It is decisive. Patton's Third Army burned more than 380,000 gallons per day during its sweep, and by 7 August, 1 week after becoming operational, its reserves were exhausted. So what was the German answer? They assumed the Allies would culminate. They assumed the pursuit would run out of gas and collapse into a pause. They assumed they'd have time to rebuild a line. That assumption was the hinge. The answer arrived on the 25th of August, 1944. The Red Ball Express began, a one-way loop road system running day and night, built to drag supply forward faster than German staff officers believed possible. It started with 67 truck companies and surged to 132 companies, nearly 6,000 vehicles. Within days, the Germans watched with interest. This was not a new tank. This was a new kind of army. On the 29th of August, Red Ball hauled a peak single-day record: 5,958 vehicles carrying 12,342 tons of supplies to forward depots. Total tonnage moved by the end of the program, the 16th of November 1944, reached 412,193 tons. And gasoline was the core. One logistics study notes the system strained so hard it could consume as much as 300,000 gallons per day just to keep Red Ball trucks themselves moving. They couldn't quite believe it. A supply line that burned fuel to deliver fuel. But that was exactly the point. America could afford inefficiency if it bought speed. Germany could not. Now return to Kummersdorf. Because this is the thread. In 1943, the Sherman test began as a technical autopsy. By 1944, the Sherman had become the skeleton key to Allied tempo. By 1945, German commanders would talk about it the way exhausted men talk about weather. Unstoppable. Not because it was perfect, because it was constant. Enemy perception line, filed, Rundstedt, Rommel, model, each understood that Allied air power and material flow made classical German counterstroke doctrine almost impossible. Rundstedt's own report on Normandy emphasized the Allied advantage in the air and the difficulty of moving reserves under attack. And it wasn't just air. It was everything behind the air. What happened next stunned them, because by September 1944, Allied intelligence itself was predicting Germany could not recover. A SHAFG-2 summary near the end of August declared, "The enemy in the West has had it," describing German forces as disorganized battle groups. The Combined Intelligence Committee predicted organized resistance might not continue beyond the 1st of December 1944. But then the Germans held. They rebuilt lines. They fought in Lorraine. They bled the war into winter. And that's where the story introduces the scandal and the setback, because the man most associated with speed, Patton, had almost been removed from the stage. On the 3rd of August 1943 and the 10th of August 1943 in Sicily, Patton slapped two soldiers suffering battle fatigue. Eisenhower's formal rebuke followed on the 17th of August 1943, condemning brutality and abuse of the sick. For months, Patton's career hung. His command prospects narrowed. His public role became politically dangerous. They couldn't quite believe their luck. German intelligence saw a famous American general sidelined. Allied unity looked fragile, a commander removed as a tempo reduced. But there was something else, the deception. In early 1944, Patton was used as the visible commander of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, designed to help persuade German planners that the main invasion would strike Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. The Germans watched with interest, because they wanted Calais to be the answer. After the Normandy landings, German 15th Army remained tied to the Pas-de-Calais threat longer than logic suggested. Fortitude reinforced what Hitler already believed. And Patton's name, reputation, and visibility were part of that architecture, even if later historians argue how central he truly was in German files. Enemy perception line recorded. The Germans didn't always track Patton as a grand strategist, but they did see him, later, as the most aggressive Allied armored commander. So what was he doing? He was being used as a phantom, then unleashed as a real threat. And that pivot, phantom to pursuit, mirrors the Sherman's own role. A tank dismissed as mediocre, then revealed as operational poison. Now the late war impossible move, the Ardennes offensive punched into Allied lines. Bastogne became a crisis point. German staff officers expected the Allies to react slowly, realign, build supply, gather fuel, then counterattack. They expected time. They were counting on that time. Patton didn't give it to them. On the 19th of December 1944, 3rd Army staff began the turn, a 90-degree pivot. Large formations redirected north under winter conditions, aimed at Bastogne. And on the 26th of December 1944, the relief reached the town, ending the siege. The Germans watched with interest, because this was the operational version of what the Sherman had shown at Kummersdorf. Not brilliance, not a miracle weapon, a machine and an army, built to move when movement should be impossible. Enemy perception line, remembered. German commanders had fought retreats on the Eastern Front. They understood what it meant when an enemy hit the flank before you finished the plan. They understood tempo as a weapon, and now they were on the receiving end. After the war, interrogators asked the surviving German leadership what they had believed in 1944. Alfred Jodl, in captivity, admitted the truth with a staff officer's exhaustion. The war in the West was already lost at the time of the breakthrough and the beginning of the War of Movement in France. That statement is the final link, because the War of Movement was not a personality trait. It was a supply system. It was a manufacturing doctrine. It was the Sherman multiplied by everything behind it. So why did German engineers test a captured Sherman and realize why they were losing the war? Because the Sherman forced a different kind of defeat, Not dramatic, not cinematic. Administrative. A German Panther might win a duel and still lose the campaign if it broke down. Couldn't be recovered. And couldn't be replaced. A Sherman might lose a duel and still win the war if it returned tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. The Germans watched with interest. They knew what speed did to an army in retreat. They knew what it meant when an enemy could afford to keep going. So why did they fear the Sherman more than the tanks that outgunned it? Because it made the Allied doctrine possible. Speed and shock and violence, sustained by repair, fuel, and replacement. It would be fast. It would be violent. And it would cost them. Germany built tanks like they did, only better.